Good evening and happy Saturday from Metro Manila, the Philippines, Southeastern Asia. On Wednesday, November the 20th, 2019, the Labour Party's leader and at the same time the British official opposition leader, Jeremy Corbyn, sounded a profoundly left-wing, even socialist populist note, criticizing billionaires, calling for a massive increase in the wealthy British people's taxes and also massive increases in the social welfare spending and educational spending. And he went even further to the left than he had gone in the 2017 general election campaign, which he also lost. According to the latest opinion poll, the Conservatives, led by Prime Minister Boris Johnson, are leading the Labourites by 16%. So the Conservatives are likely to win the December the 12th, 2019 general election, although whether they will have an overall majority or not is still somewhat in doubt. And of course, these elections tend to narrow as far as the opinion polls are concerned compared to the results in the end. In any case, in 1983, Michael Foot, who was the Labour Party's unabashedly left-wing, even socialist leader, prepared an election manifesto, a program that some cynics called history's longest suicide note. It included massive tax increases and spending increases, unilateral disarmament, and Britain's exit from the European Economic Community. Not that Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was a great friend of European integration either. That was actually one of the remote reasons or secondary reasons for her downfall in 1990. But in any case, Labour Party also suffered not just from a too left-wing election manifesto back in 1983, but also from the creation of another competing left-wing party, the Social Democratic Party, in 1981, which was probably trying to emulate the Nordic or Scandinavian social democratic parties. The Social Democratic Party teamed up with the Liberals to create the Alliance, and that took over 23% of the vote, while the Labour Party slumped below 28%, and although the Conservatives suffered a 1.5% drop in the popular vote to 42.4%, they won the election very easily because the centre-left vote was divided between the Labourites and the Social Democratic Liberal Alliance, which ironically together took over 50% of the vote. So the centre-left votes division, coupled with the first past the post-electoral system and the idea among enough British voters that Margaret Thatcher deserved another mandate to continue her socio-economic reforms, and that Michael Foot was simply too left-wing to unite the country. Those factors helped, and of course the fact that the British economy was recovering at last by 1983 from its rather deep recession of the early 1980s, and that Margaret Thatcher allegedly proved that had proven that the British army was still an effective fighting force in the brief Falkland Islands War in 1982. That was reminiscent of the British victories in the First and Second World Wars, although of course it was a small, albeit very distant, regional war against a military junta that would yield power to a civilian elected democratic government in Argentina in 1983. But maybe Jeremy Corbyn is doing this in order to offer the voters a clear choice. But it may well mean that he will suffer a major loss in the upcoming general election and will shortly thereafter resign as the Labour Party's leader. And then the Labour Party will look for some more centrist leader, maybe some kind of reinvention of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, who were able to govern between them Britain from 1997 to 2010. But let's look at the details from the website of The Economist magazine. The big red book, red of course refers to socialism, and after all, at least until Tony Blair came along the British Labour Party's conventions include the singing of the Red Flag anthem. I'm not sure if the International or the International Workers' March has been sung at those gatherings or conferences lately. Labour publishes a manifesto to expand the British state. Jeremy Corbyn proposes continental levels of spending, continental meaning continental European levels of spending, but without the same level of taxation for most workers. Published on November the 21st, 2019. Jeremy Corbyn served up Labour's manifesto on November the 21st. Okay, thanks for the correction. So on Thursday, November the 21st, not on Wednesday, November the 20th. With a dollop of populism, billionaires were bashed, journalists were booed until Mr. Corbyn demanded the assembled crowd of Labour activists stop. The party's leader took aim at a rich, powerful elite who do not want real change. Why would they? Asked Mr. Corbyn at launch in Birmingham. The system is working just fine for them. It's rigged in their favor. Well, Donald Trump also talked about the rigged political system in 2016. Beneath the populist rhetoric of the many against a greedy few, the clear outlines of a Corbyn-led government emerged in the manifesto. Under Labour, Britain would have a larger, deeper state with a return to universalism at its core. Universalism meaning that all the social programs, or virtually all of them, would be offered to all the British people, regardless of their ability to pay. Its frontiers would expand to cover everything from water supply to broadband internet connection to how much a landlord may charge a tenant. Where the state already rules, such as in education or health, the government would go deeper with the introduction of free childcare for preschoolers and a national care service for the elderly. At the last election in 2017, Labour surprised its opponents and voters with the most left-wing manifesto since the 1980s, promising sweeping nationalizations, higher taxes and more spending. And as we know, Labour lost the election, although the Conservatives failed to win a majority. The 2019 version goes further. 2 years ago, Mr. Corbyn promised £48 billion or $62 billion US dollars or 2.3% of GDP extra day-to-day spending. This time the number is £83 billion, as Labour refuses to be outgunned in a fiscal arms race between Britain's three main political parties. Its manifesto mixes the party's greatest hits with some new tunes. The government would spend £75 billion on building 100,000 council homes per year, paid for from £150 billion transformation fund, a pot of money for capital spending on public services. Rent increases would be capped at inflation rate. The most eye-catching proposal, a plan to nationalize BT's or British Telecom's broadband operations and then offer the service free of charge, was announced the previous week. Surviving policies from 2017 include a plan to nationalize utilities alongside Royal Mail and the rail network, and a range of new rights for workers, from a higher minimum wage to restored collective bargaining rights. All told, government spending would hit 45.1% of GDP, the highest ratio in the post-war era, meaning post-World War II era, not post-9/11 era. Outside of a recession and more than in Germany, according to Resolution Foundation, a think tank. To pay for it all, very rich people and businesses would be clobbered. Corporation tax would rise to 26% from 19% now, which Labour believes somewhat optimistically would raise another £24 billion by 2024. This, of course, would lead to a rather massive exodus of such businesses, or at least their main branch offices, from Britain to lower taxes and lower social spending countries, especially in Asia. Oil and gas companies face a windfall tax on profits, but Labour ducked the chance to pay for its spending by increasing taxes on middling earners. The party kept its pledge to raise taxes only on those who earn more than £80,000 a year. Universal services apparently do not require universal tax increases. Others have their doubts. Labour's tax plans are simply not credible, and I would agree, says Paul Johnson, head of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, another think tank. Three main problems lurk in Labour's proposal. First, the party has promised continental levels of spending without corresponding levels of taxation for the bulk of Britons. That is not sustainable. In other words, it would greatly increase or clearly increase the British budget deficit and the national debt. The second issue is capacity. Labour's manifesto contained 5 sections, some of them alone, such as promising to spend £250 billion on green measures, would be enough to keep a government busy for a 5-year term. Implementing them all at once while simultaneously trying to resolve Brexit looks unmanageable, particularly for a minority or coalition government, the most realistic scenario. The third is the party's effect on business. Taken on their own, plans to raise the minimum wage, give employees full rights from day one to increase corporation tax might be digestible for British firms. Taking together, they would be hard to swallow. Without a big change in Labour's fortunes, Mr. Corbyn will not enter Downing Street next month. Actually, he will probably then exit the Labour Party's leadership, and the party will elect a more centrist and electable leader. But politics has changed during his tenure as Labour leader. During this election, the Liberal Democrats have cast themselves as the heirs to the fiscal caution of the coalition government, with the Conservatives under former Prime Minister David Cameron from 2010 to 15. Yet they still managed to announce £64 billion in new spending in their manifesto launch on November the 20th. The Conservative manifesto, expected in a few days, will include pledges of extra spending. For the first time in a decade, whoever wins the next election, the state will get substantially bigger. In other words, the deficit is likely to grow, and so is the national debt. And then the British government's or Britain's credit rating may well suffer, which of course means that the British government will have to borrow money at higher interest rates, which will further increase its spending. Perhaps Mr. Corbyn had this in mind when, at the end of his speech, he quoted a famous, albeit controversial, Chilean communist poet and politician, Pablo Neruda. "You can cut all the flowers, but you cannot keep spring from coming."